Theoretically, we are now live. We set this up in a hurry because the film has been doing so well, and we're so excited. We're over 200 reviews that we wanted to do a sequel to the super stream that we had last Friday, but a special UK edition. So I wanted to get the superstars of the UK. Naturally, I'm being joined by one of my favorites and certainly a personal friend of mine, Isabella Cooper, Dr. Cooper. I want to say good morning to us Yankees over here, but good afternoon to you over there in the UK. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you. It's a lovely afternoon here in London, bright and sunny.
Awesome. Now, I know you're like an insanely busy scientist, so there's no wrong answer to what I'm about to ask, but have you had a chance to see our film?
I haven't. I literally haven't had a moment. I'm dying to see it, but by the end of the day, I'm wiped. I'm absolutely wiped out. You know, but I'm very, very much looking forward to it. In actual fact, I want to watch it with key people with me, so we watch it together.
Fantastic. Yeah. I hope you enjoy it. I mean, here's the thing. Quite literally, we were just released last week, and I myself work with a lot of colleagues all over the place who tend to be busy. I had the pleasure of being able to be introduced to your lab and everything that you do, your team, all of it last year. And it was a bit overwhelming. You've got so much going on. Can you give us a little like taste of what's happening right now, like of what you can share?
Okay, so of course, as you know the Ketosis trial that we conducted, because we have other research going on at the same time, which I'll mention. But with regards to the actual Ketosis trial, when I designed that trial, I knew that no one would be insane enough to ever do it again. So under that anticipation, and just knowing truly how expensive it is to run a trial, to conduct research, I really sort of thought, failing to prepare is preparing to fail. And how can I maximize what we're doing here, the money we're spending here, the time we're spending here, the effort of all the participants, everything, so that we know there's going to be so many other questions in the future that we won't have thought of. So I did a calculation of what's the legal amount of blood I could take from the participants at each phase.
Awesome.
There is a calculation. It's a different amount between males and females, because males can actually give blood 3 times a year, and females is twice a year, obviously due to the menstrual cycle. This is premenopausal women. So in doing that calculation, then deciding, how much do we take off as plasma in heparin or in EDTA, how much in serum, and then this will determine also how much liquid biopsy we could get, which would be the PBMCs, the white blood cells as well. And then from there, calculating, well, if I run an assay, some assays only require 10 microliters of serum or plasma, and some assays require 100 times 3 when you do everything in triplicate. And if you store samples as 1 mil, 1.5 mil, and you thaw it, in most optimum research you shouldn't be doing multiple freeze thaws. Some molecules can endure that, but the most ideal is you don't freeze and thaw again and introduce more variability. And so then the calculation was, well, okay, I know these assays require 100 microliters each, I know these assays require 10 microliters each. So what's the minimum amount I have to allocate into all the vials? I mean, we just had this crazy, and this is on unknown markers, unknown things that we want to think of.
Yep.
And so, with that, there was a lot of planning. And then ultimately what ended up happening was with each participant actually came into the lab on their lab days 3 times. And we essentially collected and stored over 300 vials of plasma serum, as well as other vials in our liquid nitrogen for the PBMCs, the white blood cells. So as a result, we have a lot of sample stored in liquid nitrogen, which is fantastic. And those aliquots are really perfectly aliquoted out with a little bit of wastage, because there's always a certain amount you need because of the way that you conduct your assays and loss in pipetting. So we have, I really should do a proper calculation, but I know that we've got over sort of 12,000 samples to get through. Okay.
Well, and let me just pause you for 1 sec, because while no doubt a number of lay people are probably going, whoa, this is just like so much, I wanna kind of layperson speak real quick why it is that you and I are so excited about discussing the very thing you're talking about right now. Is we know there's a lot of research that's done that would say, oh, well, just go ahead and be sure to collect enough of a sample that we don't have to think about whether we got enough, right? You know that there's a number of people who are saying, "Oh, well, just make sure that enough is taken," without actually thinking about things like what could actually be enough that is taken so that we don't have to worry about an undersample way late into the process, right? And
Mhm.
whether or not the storage itself is consistent. But one of the very first things that impressed me when just discussing a little bit about this was that you go even further steps as far as confirming things like the plates themselves that you're doing the testing against are internally consistent with themselves. That's its own process. And I was so blown away because honestly, I'm usually careful in that I caveat all the time. You know, you're one of my favorite uh, testing scientists, or you're one of my favorite statisticians, or something like that. Isabella, there's nobody I've met that comes anywhere close. You are the pentacle. You are the quintessential version of what I imagine for somebody who genuinely puts an enormous amount of thought on making sure that the data collected can be trusted.
Mm.
So you put so much effort in making sure the collection process, that preparation, like you just said, that preparation level is at its peak capacity so that you can trust the data. No one I know comes close. And if there was a competition, and there should be, by the way, there should be an award for preparation for doing a
I think
scientific
so. I
study.
really do think so.
Of
I
course
mean,
you
look,
do, because you'll win it like every year, right? Like there's no question.
yeah, so in our research group, and as we, other scientists do join with us, I would say it is a prerequisite as a job trait, is to have OCD. And everyone's
Yeah, yeah.
competing on their OCD-ness. It's considered a positive trait.
I'll jump in that competition. I like that. Go.
Yeah, yeah. And I had an element of sort of 2015-16. I designed the trial in 2018, and I was very, very aware of the haters in reality.
Mhm.
And I just thought, I'm going to do this in such a way, aside from being a really nerdy biochemistry, scientist at the time, I just thought, I'm going to do this in such a way that we are very, very as confident as one can possibly be of our data. And to the point that, in actual fact, whenever we're deciding to use an assay, where possible, if that assay, which is a method of detecting a biological molecule, is where possible, we will use multiple different modalities to see if they agree with each other as well. And so we have two completely independent external labs that are clinical labs, as well as our own lab. And even within our own lab, we can use different assay methods. And so it has costed genuinely an absolute fortune to do
Right.
it. But by running samples in different methodologies, in blinded labs too, and the data, of course, they're not going to be the most identical number. They're within a low range of differentiation, and we aim for what's called coefficient of variation differences in our assays and between days and between to not only be in single digits but to be below 5. It's a target of ours all the time. And so by doing this, though, we can know in the future, if we only run one type of assay type, because we've actually gone to that effort between using different types of assays, using different labs as well to corroborate whether that assay is reliable, it then allows us to know that going forward we can use that assay, that one single assay. So it was an early cost, but we're saving ultimately later on in that regard. And as I mentioned, we're looking at between assays, but we're also looking at within assays. And within the assay, there's going to be multiple plates, so between the plates too. So it is a bit of a statistics nerd out. And
Well, but it's also a matter of security, right? So why do you have things like redundancy? Well, you have
Yes.
redundancy so that you can feel more confident. It's not just in the data, but, like,
Mm.
you think about all of this work that's put together to recruit the people, to get the funding, to why would you make a mistake on something so crucial as
Yes.
the capture of the data that you wanna get itself? So, of course, as you said a little bit earlier, you're trying to see how much blood you can get from your participants, not because you're trying to torture them, right? But because it allows for things like redundancy where you can send, this came up very early on when I was doing my N of 1 experiments, and there was an NMR, a nuclear magnetic resonance test, which was all the rage because it was now available to consumers, and I was just a consumer at that time going, "Yes, I wanna get the best test," but, oof, is there a chance it could be wrong? And what is the chance that it could be wrong? And what is the chance that it could give and I wasn't that much of an expert at the time. I had barely gotten into the science, but I wanted to know, like, is there a fail rate for even just the basics of the lipids? And so even then, I was getting a simple lipid panel as well with it. Even then, I was thinking, I want some redundancy. I wanna see how much these 2 agree with each other, because 'cause I'll feel more comfortable if it does turn out that they agree with each other on a regular basis, and if everything else makes sense. But then whenever I did do an experiment and I was just trying to keep it cheap and I did a single marker and I did get a weird result, man, I was always frustrated if I only did the single marker and I could have done another assay to get redundancies so that I could at least have it confirmed. That's why,
Mm.
for example, whenever I get insulin and C-peptide, right?
Yeah.
Um, knowing the pulsatile aspect of insulin. But guess what? After over 100 tests that I've done with insulin and C-peptide, it turns out it's not as pulsatile as I thought it was when I started, or at least, getting back to the assays themselves. So, yes, I love that you not only talk about getting these samples, run with different assays, but that literally you're shipping them. It's not just different companies, right? You're shipping them to different labs, physically in different places. So you've got absolute top shelf A++ class redundancy.
Yeah.
Again, to feel super confident in the data that you have collected, that you can feel strongly about the results you're reporting.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting you say about the pulsatility. I don't have the answer to this, but I wonder if there is better pulsatility in metabolically healthy people versus metabolically unhealthy people, right?
That's a great question, right?
Yeah, I really wonder that. And there is also, again, a difference between those who were metabolically unhealthy and have now gone into ketosis and maintained it for a long time. They're not the same as people who have
Yes.
never had metabolic dysregulation. So, there's a big question between those there, because we know that signals that are supposed to be pulsatile seem to be inefficient somehow. We don't know how, but somehow. So we get this chronic signaling, which ironically goes into what we always called resistance, insulin resistance, leptin resistance, these sort of things. And so, as I said, I do wonder if there's a difference in that pulsatility. And it's one of the ones that I didn't anticipate. So I didn't take a every 5-minute sample in my participants in ketosis, out to ketosis. I would have loved to, all in hindsight, but there it is. But yeah, that would have been. There are often little things that do come up. Why didn't I do that? But anyway.
So we'll speak just briefly to the movie, even though you haven't had a chance to see it yet, and even though you are going to. We are looking at folks like me, kind of goes over my story, but we also connect with a number of folks who are here in the US that are lean mass hyperresponders that see some efficacy with going on a ketogenic diet, but then they face that concern level that I was facing from 10 years ago. Many of them are facing now. Many of the ones that we've interviewed have faced it long before I was even in the keto space, which I believe also includes Dr. Jen Unwin, who we'll have on in a little bit. But what I did kind of like was that in the movie, spoiler alert, we go to the UK at one point and we're at a PHC dinner We get some footage with Sam Feltham. We also interview Jen Unwin. And if I recall correctly, I did, or the team reached out to you, but naturally you were just very busy. You're so,
Sorry.
yeah. Well, here's the other part of it though, too, is the nature of what you do also has to fit a very tight schedule a lot of times, especially
Yeah.
if you're in the midst of the research. There's no getting around that part of it.
Mm.
Even if you've got your team doing it, you need to supervise carefully. There's no way you want. And again, I would be the same way. I'd be the same way if I were you in those terms. But one thing that I do want to wrap in is that your experiments help to bring a vital piece of data back to us with regard to the lipid energy model. I realize been a little while since we did this, but are you able to expand on how this connects with the thyroid?
Yes, so I actually remember reading your 2022 paper, and actually, funny enough, let's go back further. When I was designing the trial, I was aware of these sort of little what was going on in the background, and it wasn't my area of focus. My area really was just the insulin and mitochondria. But I just thought when I was aware of the statin arguments, the statin wars, the cholesterol wars, and I just thought, well, I'm going to run the lipid panel and I'm going to collect more samples ready for more extensive research in that, because I think that we might have some really interesting answers here, because it's in a really healthy cohort, and we know we're suppressing ketosis, which I would say is the modern day intervention in actual fact, as well as I heard a lot about thyroid. When you get ketosis, you're going to wreck your thyroid, you'll be low thyroid. And so by the time you had your 2022 publication, I was like, I think I've given an answer to one part of this paper.
Yeah, just for the audience, by the 2022, you're talking about quite literally the published paper for the lipid energy model. And
Yes.
that was a huge moment, because I'd been doing presentations on it, I'd been discussing it with the community and so forth. And props to both Dr. Nick Norwitz, Dr. Adrian Sotomoda, and in particular my co-senior author on that paper, Anatole Kontouche, who's over there across the pond, for finally getting this thing together, codifying it, putting it into the research. And so, boy, am I glad to hear that yet again, somebody like Dr. Cooper would be reading it then and then connecting it to her existing study. So continue on.
Yeah, very exciting. So I reached out to Nick, and then he put us all in contact. And then obviously we had a really exciting meeting with all the data and looking at it, and sort of just eyeballing it alone, you could see there was something going on. And of course, Adrian Sotomoda, with his statistic genius, then managed to really sort of tease it out, because I suspected that the changes so when we just looked at group average with regards to changes in lipid parameters, we didn't see anything, but I suspected it had more to do with with BMI and with thyroid, and therefore we would have to do a different style rather than the sort of generic what you're taught at university, what's typically used, which is just ANOVAs and t-tests. It needed to be a lot more sensitive in that regard. And Adrian was fantastic at being able to help us do that. And we already in our first paper had really understood that the low thyroid that you do actually see in the healthy cohorts that's maintaining ketosis is not the same low thyroid in someone who's metabolically dysregulated, which for lack of a better word, let's call it sort of thyroid depletion, hypothyroid. It's a sort of, let's say, overused thyroid, and it's become a bit exhausted, you could say. Whereas in the healthy setting, the low thyroid hormone T3 is because you actually don't need it. You don't need as much. It's not you don't need it,
Right.
it's just you don't need that much. And you're not damaging your mitochondria as much. So if you're not damaging your mitochondria as much, you're not going to need as much thyroid hormone to save the day. And there is a strong relationship with T3 and fat metabolism, burning fatty acids and things like that. And so it was really fascinating to see this very strong relationship between low BMI in ketosis, which is a euketonemia state. It's normal glucose, ketones above 0.5 consistently, and and having low thyroid and low thyroid T3, not a lack of thyroid sufficiency, but then having a higher LDL response. So it was really, really interesting. And of course, there's so much we still haven't figured out, but it's the body does change its way that it's transporting things around the body, how you're metabolizing. Now, I think there's probably some differences between males and females, I suspect, just because
I think
males
so too.
yeah, and I think that's to do with the fact that males have a tendency to burn more fatty acids, ship fatty acids around with the LDLs, and less sort of hyper release of ketones. And I think, I just see it. Females tend to have higher levels of ketones, much easier production of ketones. And this is way out there. Again, I don't know. Maybe it contributes to female longevity, that women produce ketones better, and there's some level of health benefit from that. But I'm only guessing. So it's just, I have a gazillion questions every day, all the time.
Of course. Well, so this is why that was key. The as you know, the lipid energy model is based. We believe that a major entry point is going below a certain threshold of glycogen levels in the liver. So that's stored glucose levels in the liver. You get it low enough, and it's going to activate a cascade that has to do with the HPA axis and thyroid levels that ultimately next step come to this overall fatty acid turnover in the body. Now, these two pieces, right? The lower glycogen stores in the liver here, we feel really sure about the transport of fatty acids, especially on ApoB containing lipoproteins, like the one we're really interested in, which is VLDL. Why? Because it becomes LDL. These are two, this is like A, and this is like maybe M in the alphabet, right? There's this cascade thing that I just kind of slipped by that is complex, right? How does the body really know that it's reconfiguring into this now much more fatty acid driven version? And this also brings us back to ketosis itself. Well, of course, we love to detect ketones. Ketones are just so sexy and interesting. And we love to say keto diet. Nobody wants to say fatty acid diet, right? But I would argue it's really more accurately stated as a fatty acid diet, or a fatty acid metabolism, I should say, fatty acid centric metabolism, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
But that whole sector of the cascade does deserve some special understanding. But exactly what you said is worth drawing some attention to, which is a lot of people go on a ketogenic diet. They see their thyroid levels change, and in particular, like T3 going down, and their doctor or even the community they're in says, "Oh no, it's hurting your thyroid. You have hypothyroidism, and you need to do something about it." Right now, for what it's worth, you used a particular word that needs to get used with things like insulin. How do you know the difference between somebody who's on a ketogenic diet who has and tests at very low levels of insulin versus somebody who's a type 1 diabetic? So if I see a lean mass hyperresponder and they've got 2 to 3 milli-IU of insulin, that can show up as, bold-faced type on the test, because it would say, whoa, this is low. How do we know it's low? Well, before a ketogenic diet, it would likely suggest insulin insufficiency. That's the word you want to use, insufficiency, because it suggests a true dysregulation. That's why a type 1 diabetic's glucose levels could be ridiculously high, because the insulin is not just low, it's too low for what the body's trying to do. So then we go to the ketogenic diet and we're seeing the same thing, except that the lower levels of insulin actually are very steady. They seem to be very regulated. They seem to be homeostatic. They seem to be actually maintaining a regulatory state to where, yes, you want insulin levels lower because you're more based on fatty acid turnover. So this brings us back to the thyroid, right? T3 levels are low. Darn it. Are they low for what would be considered, clinical hypothyroidism?
So we look at the TSH. The TSH looks perfectly normal, which is great. And we also look at the RQ, the respiratory quotient. So then we can actually see, are these participants fat burners, essentially, in fatty acid metabolism? And of note, the participants had no exercise, so fasting level RQs that were better than high performance athletes after 40 minutes of their exercise. So that's how amazing they were as fat burners. And also what you see in the time that we were measuring their RQ, so how much oxygen consumption they're consuming and how much carbon dioxide that they're releasing. They also weren't burning protein, and you know they're coming into the lab. They're coming in 12 hours fasted. They have bloods and anthropometrics first before they go into the chamber for measuring their RQ. And so, you know, they're roughly 13 and a half, 14 hours fasted. So, you know, in the carbohydrate, you know, hypoketonemia state, so not in ketosis, insulin elevated enough to suppress ketosis, you would start, you know, especially if someone's metabolically unwell for a longer period of time, that sort of duration of fasting might actually come with some level of protein catabolism, like breakdown of protein, of lean mass. And we didn't actually see that, obviously, our participants. And phase 1 is the phase of euketonemia, being in ketosis, fatty acid metabolism, that was indicative of their long-term state. There'd been no intervention prior to that, 6 whole months prior, where we
Can I
had...
ask a quick question? So is it predominantly understood, and again, predominantly, maybe not fully, that if you're burning protein via this way, that it likely is lean mass that's on you versus, say, what you've gotten dietarily?
I mean, I wouldn't be able to say 100%. I mean, maybe you've got some leftover breaking down food that's in your intestines. It's perfectly possible. It's kind of unlikely, and in our particular setting we can know that better because we know the exact time of when our participants ate, and you know, there was a lot earlier than even when they went to bed. So, you know, even though we say 12 hours fasted, they're often much longer fasted than that because they've had their dinner sort of about, you know, 6 p.m. and they're coming into the lab, you know, at 8 a.m. And then so it's slightly longer. Add that blood works, anthropometrics, do the RQ. So that would be 9:30. So it's a long enough time. But no, you know, if there is some undigested protein that's in the intestines, in the stomach and intestines, then arguably it could be slightly from the diet. The fact that we don't see protein breakdown tells us that's not the case, I would say.
Right. Right. It at least it helps to eliminate the false positive versus the...
Yeah. And look, I would argue, you know, especially people who are on a carnivore diet, so there's a lot less fiber. I first prefix, what is the purpose of eating? Because nowadays we kind of think the purpose of eating is pleasure, but the purpose of eating is to gain the nutrients to sustain life at its optimal. That's the purpose. There's a functional purpose. So ergo, you don't eat to make more stools. Like, you're not eating to make poop, right?
Yeah.
You are eating to maximally absorb everything. You know, we have, you know, evolved in a way to have the luxury of all the food that we have and the storage methodologies and things like that. But, you know, without always harking back to evolution, because we can't test it, at the same time, we knew there weren't fridges. We knew that we didn't have all the sophisticated methods. And so you don't know if you're going to have a meal tomorrow. You don't know if you're going to have a meal in the next 3 days. So it would be arguable that the way we would have adapted for optimal survival would be whatever we put in our mouth to maximally absorb what we can. And in actual fact, to have as little waste, there's not going to be no waste, of course, because just biological processes produces waste. So we need a waste removal system, of which is through the stools, through the kidneys, through the saliva, through the skin. But evolutionarily, again, if you consider, you know, being efficient, you would expect less waste, and you would expect, you know, less of the type of waste that your potential predator could find you on. And so, you know, being in a carnivore diet, what we found actually within our trial, it wasn't a carnivore trial, but of course there were high meat eaters, low fiber eaters in general. is that our participants had really, really high levels of GLP-1. And so, you know, that would slow down motility, gastric motility. And in this argument, it would be a good thing. It's the right kind of food that would be staying in your stomach and your small intestines. You know, if you are going to eat fiber, that should be down in your colon, where one argues then it's been fermented. So having that stay in your stomach and your colon, your small intestines, sorry, is not a good thing. But if you're eating a low fiber residue and it's inside of the stomach and the small intestines, going through very, very slowly, the purpose of going through very slowly is because that is where they are digested and absorbed. So evolutionary, again, it fits the concept in that regard. And so we did see this really very, very clear high GLP-1. And when we talk about this sort of low basal insulin in that sort of setting, not only are we sort of thinking about that low insulin, unlike a type 1 diabetic, it comes with this higher insulin sensitivity, so less does more. At the same time, there are other molecules that then actually are working together with insulin, improving glucose uptake, fatty acid oxidation, all of these sort of things. And so results in to need less insulin, essentially. And so one of them would be like osteocalcin, even though we actually saw lower osteocalcin in ketosis. And, you know, I originally had thought I would expect to see higher osteocalcin. And then the data came out and it was the opposite. And I really had to sort of rack my brains to try to understand that. And I just thought, it's that same thing, you know, sensitivity. So we think leptin should make you feel full, but we see higher leptin, you don't feel as full. We think that higher insulin should put away glucose, but when we see higher insulin, we see higher glucose. And osteocalcin sort of falls in that same category. And so and it's like T3. So in people who are really metabolically unwell, they have much less osteocalcin. And that is highly likely due to the actual cells that make osteocalcin are largely actually not very healthy, not very well. They're not synthesizing osteocalcin so much because they actually prefer to fuel off of fatty acids. And as insulin is around too much, it inhibits their ability to produce osteocalcin. And then they actually mineralize, and they mineralize in a very different way to normal bone. And they create this sort of fossilization that's detectable by their mineral components that are actually different to regular bone ossification. And that's why you actually see type 2 diabetics, metabolically unwell people, non-premenopausal women, they have a tendency to have normal to higher bone mineral density, and yet they have the same fragility fracture rates as osteoporotic people. So they are not osteoporotic. They actually are ossified. They're fossilized in some ways. So then they're not producing as much osteocalcin. But in the case of when you're healthy and you're in ketosis, then a lot of that osteocalcin is going into the bones. It's going into the bones and it's being released again in this pulsatile way. It's about a 5-minute pulsatility that matches to insulin. And what's really interesting about osteocalcin is it itself, it increases glucose uptake in fat cells and muscle cells. And then it actually enhances insulin signaling on cells for glucose uptake. So you add a little bit of osteocalcin to the insulin. Now the insulin, the same amount of insulin has a bigger effect.
Okay, that makes sense to me, though, because I believe that there's greater local glucose uptake, particularly for obligate cells like erythrocytes and so forth. So, okay, this is okay. I guess let's go full geek out for just a second. I believe that there's a lot of lean mass hyperresponders in the LMHR Facebook group, for example, and this is a common thing that I was observing as a pattern going back to 2018, but that relative to their sedentary, less metabolically healthy counterparts, they would have lower beta hydroxybutyrate levels. So they would test their keto mojo and they'd be like, my BHB is only coming in at like, 0.5 or even 0.4 or something like that. Why is it so hard for me to quote unquote get into ketosis? Now, spoiler alert, you mentioned it earlier. I've always thought the real gold standard is not present levels of beta hydroxybutyrate in the blood. That's a snapshot. And it says what's in transit, but not yet in use. We don't know how much is coming in. We don't know how much is going out. But then there's one other factor that's crucial, which is that I believe lean mass hyperresponders, particularly if their LDL cholesterol levels are extremely high, it's very suggestive of that turnover I was just talking about with VLDL to LDL. I'm interested in how much the fate of fatty acids in somebody who has high LDL but low beta hydroxybutyrate, the fate of those fatty acids in their liver are proportionally heading more towards the esterification onto triglycerides, onto onboarding, onto VLDL. And thus you have greater VLDL secretion with proportionately lower ketogenesis, thus ketone secretion, right?
Yeah, I mean, and then again, bringing into men and women differences, right? So
Right.
I think when this is studied, I think they need to be separated out as a cohort, because I think it will actually confuse the data as well in this regard. Men having larger livers as well, muscle proportions different. So there are, I mean, we know that with liver markers, ALT, AST, liver markers, they have different reference ranges between men and women because of that difference there alone. And just as an added little thing, you can use the ALT to AST ratio. Like we talked about redundancy. So if you can have multiple markers that can help you understand what phenotype you're in, or how sure are you that's a false positive or a false negative, then ALT to AST ratio is quite a good one as well, because it tracks with HOMA-IR, insulin resistance, and it has a different cutoff in lean and higher weight people, in lean and obese people. So essentially, once you're above 0.8, 0.82, 0.8 for the ratio of ALT to AST, in lean people, you've now shifted into a not healthy HOMA-IR. And in obese, larger people, they will have a larger liver, and hence the ratio goes up to 1.02. And then the reason why I'm saying this is because your HOMA-IR, it's about 30% of people will have a false negative. So they'll think that they're healthy and they're actually not that healthy. And so by measuring the liver, so the liver tells you so much.
Oh my gosh. It's I like to think of it as the conductor, right? With like all of the tissue around it is the orchestra. But the catch is, and I like this analogy a lot, mainly because it's relying on signaling, the adipokines and the other kinds, like it's constantly listening. It's not just the metabolic brain, which is how it's normally thought of. It's doing a whole lot of internal regulation, particularly that comes around to the immune response as well. And so to me, I think a lot of metabolic disease comes down to not just, everyone keeps thinking about as insulin resistance from like an extrapolation point from regard to the cells themselves. But I would argue a lot of it is this breakdown of communication with the liver, that the liver is designed against a backdrop of an environment that our ancestors, have built on and built on and built on, that had this symphony of recognition. So getting back to what you were describing, I like to point this out all the time because we already know this. Our ancestors spent all this time dealing with one major problem, which was scarcity. We didn't have the problem of abundance. So the subcutaneous fat, which is thought to be more recent in evolution, was a huge gain, because now all of a sudden we're like, oh, guess what? We have fat. Ooh, but we also need to rearrange how our body works, how our cells work to handle a state of starvation. How do we do that? How do we pull off? And so, granted, lots of other variations of us did die off. I like bringing this up, by the way, with women who I feel like evolutionarily you understandably needed to retain fuel more than us men. Like, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, look, we know clearly in early infanthood and in teenagers and in pregnancy, the gears shift, or rather they are different when you're born, into maximal fat retention for growing, widthways and straightwise when you're a baby, for growing slightly more straight upwards in male teenagers, slightly more widthwise in female teenagers, and in pregnancy just overall. And in pregnancy, it's and not only to grow the baby, but also in anticipation of feeding that baby with breastfeeding afterwards. So, there are enough things that change during a pregnancy, as an example, that tells the body absorb more of the food that you are eating. Quite literally, if you ate the same amount of food, absorb more of it. Store it not only in your fat cells, but store it in your bones in anticipation of growing the baby that's growing in utero, but also for feeding that baby afterwards with breastfeeding. And so, those mechanisms, essentially, we're triggering through our dietary practices being non-pregnant. That's essentially what we're triggering, right? Take more from your food, store it in your fat cells, store more in your bones, because we see hyperinsulinemia people have heavier bones actually in general,
Wow.
And so we're triggering that same phenotype, and it's the same, by the way, with regards to the cancer cell phenotype, which is uncontrolled proliferation, growth proliferation with anti-apoptotic mechanism, so it can't die where it should do, and that is essentially an embryogenic phenotype. It's when an egg is first fertilized and the cells are replicating. They're de-differentiated. They're very plastic at this point. They haven't become brain tissue or colon tissue. And they are highly glycolytic. They are fermentative. And again, we're pushing naturally highly mitotic cells in that direction with the hyperinsulinemia state. Don't forget, pregnancy is a state of higher insulin. The naturally higher insulin is to drive the weight gain and the bone acquisition. So we do that,
which brings around gestational diabetes being as common as it's been, and why it's been so, even earlier, before they were actually understanding the why of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the problem with that, of course, is as the mother is exposed to more insulin and more glucose, that is going into the baby itself, the glucose, and it is actually epigenetically programming the baby to be more predispositioned to produce more insulin relative to carbohydrate exposure. But I'll take it even further, is that the insulin, the hyperinsulinemia of pregnancy, where the mother shifts into gestational diabetes, is impairing her osteocalcin synthesis. And this is very important for the production, for the baby, because in utero, babies don't produce osteocalcin. They only just start to produce it at the very, very end of full-term pregnancy. So obviously, if you have your baby by C-section earlier, they're going to lose out on this too. And essentially, that osteocalcin is 55 kilodaltons. It's 49 amino acids. It's very small. It can pass through the blood-brain barrier. And that actually passes into the baby in utero, and it stimulates neurogenesis. It has an effect on IQ, mental development.
Wow.
Yes, it has an effect on depression. So in there's obviously mostly animal studies, but there have been a few human studies. And so in animal studies, because of course it's completely unethical to do otherwise in humans, I'd argue possibly unethical in animals too, but where pregnant mice have been either genetically or with antibodies, lots of different methods, made so that they do not produce as much osteocalcin. They don't produce zero, they just produce not as much. And what they found, that the pups had increased rates of depression, anxiety, and reduced spatial learning capacity. Some of it was rescuable after birth and orally supplementing, and breast milk actually contains osteocalcin, so that's really good. I do go around looking in formulas, and I don't see it in formulas.
That's right where I was going. I was like, I doubt they would have included
I go around looking, is there osteocalcin? No osteocalcin.
Wow. So I mean, naturally my head goes straight to, I wonder if anyone would ever want to do an RCT on a ketogenic diet for pregnant women.
I'd love to do it.
But naturally, you also would need like a fairly long follow-up time, right? It'd both be expensive, and there's something else that kind of comes up a bit in the movie that we should talk about, and it's not so much in a way to complain as much as just a recognition of the environment we're in. There's a decent headwind against keto. I think that's not even in question, right? And when you watch the movie, you'll see a twist that organically occurred with regard to certain institutions and that headwind. But with regard to the thing we were just talking about, doing, say, like an RCT with keto now, and it didn't happen before, now my head gravitates toward um, you and I both being OCD and wanting to control all of the different variables. The downside is if you have other research partners, you want them to have the same level of passion of really trying to get to the answers with regard to the thing you're trying to study, right? And that's where I kind of, envy your situation, because you're doing a lot of this in a lab you control. You're doing this with participants who are highly adherent and likely know you really well, so they know how obsessive you are about making sure that you get the data just right. And I think that that's just kind of what it's going to take to get a
Yeah.
lot of the best high quality keto data captured. Because, and I'm sorry, I'm going to bring it back to, in the world of science right now, you do a search on keto, and there's unfortunately a lot of people co-opting that title. They're throwing it into their papers. They know that there's that headwind, so there are a lot of journals that like to publish bad news on keto, even when once you get into the science, they're frankly they're not doing a lot of the research in the way that we would want them to.
Yeah,
I'll put it that way, kindly.
they're rubbish. Okay, they're rubbish. They're misleading. They're telling me these are either really poor scientists or they are deliberately being misleading. It's one or the other, right? And one always likes to be polite and kind, but that gets to be a bit of a joke.
Right. I'm always doing my best to try to shape the words to still say the same thing, but rubbish, you just kind of cut straight to the chase, right? Like it's just and it's funny, Nick and I chat about this all the time because he always stays up on the studies, and so often something will come up. I love, for example, the term keto-like. One of the studies was kind of made famous because it was like, there's these problems, the keto-like diet. It's like, of course, once you look into it, it's not really like keto at all, right? It's so frustrating. But what do? It gets published because there's a demand for finding bad news with regard to low carb and keto. And I think we as good scientists are interested in, if there's anything detrimental about this state that we're interested in, we want to know, right? We genuinely do want any information. I bring this up all the time with lean mass hyperresponders. It's possible, and I've stated this many times before, it's possible that we find they're indeed not at a high cardiovascular disease risk, but that there might be some other, issues or ailments or something that could appear. And if so, I'd want to know it. I'd want to be sure everyone was informed if they became a lean mass hyperresponder to know. But it really would be nice if there wasn't a lot of, spring-loaded opinion to try to find bad things in leaving out those other things in order to not do good science. So that's
I mean, scientists and philosophers who are the movers and shakers and making the change are usually fighting against a huge tide of people who want to hold on to the dogmas. That's the reality. So I do think that it means that we are barking up the right tree. And yes, you're 100% right. I mean, I test and retest and test and retest, and I still have these moments of, what's if I'm wrong? What's if I read that wrong? I go back and read all the things again, and you just because this impacts people's health in my view. It massively does, and it's no good to reduce your heart disease risk only to give yourself cancer or Alzheimer's. So you want to be cautious that way. And I will also say there are lots of keto research in animals, but some of it will exist in human studies. I haven't obviously read every single study on the planet, but those studies are where ketosis is confirmed, and the condition they're investigating, which typically actually is cancer, is shown to progress. And people sort of walk away, whoa, and I'll tell you the reason why is not all ketogenic diets are equal, and it's not always about your keto number, right? And, I've seen animal studies, and actually some types of human studies, but animal studies where the animals were very clearly put into ketosis, but the composition of the food that they were given, instead of the control diet that they would typically be given, chow, they were given the high amount of protein would be whey and casein. They'd be given purified methionine. All three of these are potent mTOR stimulators, bear in mind, like absolutely potent. Methionine being one of the most potent, but whey and casein, and there's a reason why gym bunnies have whey and casein shakes for building muscle. It's highly anabolic. And then the fat that they're using, the typical hydrogenated canola oil, the let's go, the omega-6 trans fat, hydrogenated cyclic aldehyde, as far as we can go, adding to the fact that these ones actually contain phytoestrogens as well. So, let's go for the phytoestrogen that our body can't break down. So hormone sensitive cancers will increase as well. It's ridiculous. Who eats a purified methionine diet? And aside from gym bunnies who are having these shakes, which, seriously, people need to stop having these shakes. Then in that regard, that research that shows being in ketosis increases cancer metastases, feeds metastasis,
Right.
cancer cells. It's not incorrect for the study. It's totally correct for the way they designed that study,
Right.
using the diet, the ingredients in the diet that they used. It's
why I like
real.
It's why I like this term, species appropriate diet.
Oh,
Just
yes.
full stop. It's just, it cuts to the chase. Listen, if in order to get certain blood markers to appear, you have to design a diet or genetically design the animal, then it already by definition has a substantial confounder, by definition, right?
Yeah.
So,
Right.
okay. If you want to do that to build a hypothesis, I'll bet you and I would not object to building a hypothesis based on these kinds of models. Definitely, though, don't present it in a paper as though it's the same as an animal in a species appropriate diet reaching this state, right? We know Dr. Bickman, for example, will tell you it's very hard to get a rodent into ketosis. And we're not going to get lean mass hyperresponder rodents. It was one of the first questions I asked. And Bickman was like, actually, their lipids are very different. And I went and looked it up and I was like, oh, yeah, actually, they're wildly different. And that also got me down the road of, wait a sec, why are we basing so much on atherosclerosis with ApoB if you have to have transgenic mice in order to have like ApoB levels that are up and elevated at a certain level?
Did you know that mice eat their own poop as well? Mice eat their own nutrients from them. They are very much not like us. So.
Yeah. It's, again, build a hypothesis step by step, small steps, right? And it's okay. Don't put a big headline on your paper that says this diet causes this problem in confirmatory language. And incidentally, I feel that way, it's anyway. So it's a bit frustrating because that's the issue. Is that you want to find animals in the state of a diet that would be species appropriate for them before you start feeling more confident that you can draw stronger conclusions. And that's a controversial thing to say, right?
Yeah. And mice are, their differences in light dark, their cycles, sleep by day, awake by night. They also produce their own vitamin C. And that's going to have a huge impact on cardiovascular disease, on all vascular disease, and cancer, in actual fact. So they're a very, very poor model. And, I would really say with regards to animal studies, possibly there are better ones, but I would say that it would be dogs. It would be better studies for humans, in not that wanting dogs to have cancer, but just saying that they would be a closer approximation to humans in terms of looking at dietary effect and cancer. And maybe even cats, actually, because they're obligate carnivores. And then so you could actually tease out a little bit more there as well. But dog being man's best friend, so to speak, they've sort of somewhat co-evolved.
True. I just wish in general we would devote more money toward any kind of diet that becomes popular in its own right, but ideally with less avid stakeholders in either direction, right? Just just try to get scientists who care a lot about collecting the data effectively, and then you'll get a lot more. Now, granted, this is something I think I've chatted with you about in private quite a bit. It's just, I wish in general we would just do more data capture overall, literally pay people like a part-time salary just to capture lots of data on them, again, without stakeholder directionality. So
Yeah.
if it's a lot of data across, all these metrics and we just keep sharing it, then we can at least use it for things like hypothesis building. Okay,
Oh,
I'm doing a bad job of promoting the movie because Isabella, I always love having these geeky discussions with you and these larger scientific philosophy discussions. Let's put up real quick the UK. For anybody who's not caught it because we haven't been talking about it, in the UK right now, you can watch The Cholesterol Code, our documentary, for free. You guys
yeah.
have it on Amazon Prime for free. So there's no excuse to not watch it at this point, unless you're as busy as Isabella Cooper. By the way, you're not. Anybody who's watching this right now, the 224 people that are watching in this particular moment, thank you, by the way, for getting up so early. It's like 6:55 a.m. Here where I'm at. So I'm impressed we have that many people here. But the film is available to watch if you have a Prime membership in the UK, which I know many of you do. You can just literally open it up and watch it right now. And if you do, please consider you could also leave a rating and review, an honest review of what you think of the movie thus far. We've really appreciated all the support everyone's been able to provide in bringing more interest and attention. And incidentally, even though it says it's the cholesterol code, I really want to emphasize it has a lot of amazing stories like Jen Unwin, who will be on in a little bit, who have used the ketogenic diet for efficacy and then face the challenge of the higher levels of cholesterol. But the stories that they tell with regard to treating bipolar, treating anorexia, I'm sure, Isabella, you've come across so many people because it's like a new frontier
Mm.
of folks who found a lot of success in the ketogenic diet for various illnesses that just
Yeah.
their
I mean,
doctors may not know about.
yeah, I work with predominantly people with cancer, and unfortunately, ones who have been told there's nothing else we can do for you, palliative care, go home and give up. And the
Who
large
just
majority,
don't hear about it? Who just don't hear about the ketogenic
and
diet, at least as an option?
sadly, they're told not to do it. They're actively told
Oh,
not to do it.
why?
So their oncologists should be saying, I don't know enough of the data and research in this, so I'm not the best person to give you information on that. Instead, they say, don't do it, it's dangerous, right? That's what they say, typically. At the same time
Wow.
saying diet doesn't matter. At the same time saying
Oh
diet,
my okay.
right? And I'm
I'm gonna
very,
have a
very,
strong opinion on that one.
yeah, I'm very pleased to say the vast majority of these patients are still here, really still here,
Wow.
years later, 10 years later, 13 years later, really, and as I mentioned before, it's not an any old ketogenic diet. It is a very particular tailored ketogenic diet because the
Yeah.
needs of the cancer patient are very different to the person who needs to lose weight. And additional to that, when you go online and you just look up keto diet recipes and things like that and blogs, they're typically very, very rich in cheese. And I'm not saying that cheese causes cancer at all. I think healthy, good quality cheese is actually very, very beneficial, and other dairy products like kefir and yogurt, things like that, and even milk. But when you've got cancer, that food is not your friend. And the reason being is it's cheese is the concentrated form of milk. We
Yeah.
give it to young people to make them grow, to
Right.
proliferate their cells. It's anabolic. You do not want to consume that when you have cancer. It's a big, big thing. If I can leave that message with people, if you have a cancer diagnosis, butter and ghee are amazing for your health, just none of the other dairy.
Yeah, well, and let me tie this all up in a bow. Definitely, if you're somebody who's listening and you know somebody who is struggling with a diagnosis, check out Thomas Seyfried. I'm sure,
Mhm.
who I believe you were on stage with at one of the PHCs, if I'm not mistaken. I think he's incredible. He has a whole lot of stuff that he's published. I believe he should have a Nobel Prize right now, me personally, but his work is amazing. And of course, we're not going to suggest it's a one size fits all or it's a magic bullet or anything along those lines. But I can't believe any oncologist at this point wouldn't at least allow for their patients to look into and understand, even if, like you said, even if they themselves don't know enough
Yeah.
to know about this as a possible option for the and I know a number of success stories. I'm sure you do as well.
A lot. Actually, those success stories are what's funded our research. You know, since I raised all the funds through. I mean, a certain amount was private, my own funds, but then a large amount was consulting for patients. And you know, they didn't pay me directly. It was they donated into the research, and research that mattered to them,
Awesome.
and it produced all this work from them. You know, and because of the good outcomes, they've continued to be patrons of our lab, which is amazing. You know?
Yay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time, Isabella, and I cannot wait to see you in June, where we're going to do a Feldman protocol. I'm going to bring lots of water because I have a feeling we're going to be like
Yeah.
chatting for a while. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Definitely.
All right.
Brilliant. It was so lovely to see you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much. And we'll now add Sam Felton to the stage. Sam, how are you?
Hi, Isabella. Hi,
Like,
bye.
you guys are going to do your thing, so I'll leave now. Okay.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks. We'll see you later. So, Sam, how are you?
I'm good, mate. I'm good. You know, my head's a bit of a jungle because our conference is coming up in just a few weeks on the 16th, 17th of May in London, again at the same venue as last year. And tickets still available, live stream and in person. So make sure you go to phcukconference.org if you want to check that out. But other than that, the sun is shining here in the UK. So we're rocking and rolling into spring.
Yeah, so I want to help you plug that again. So phcconference.org, is that right?
phcukconference.org. Yeah.
phc.uk. Yes. Anyway, just look up Public Health Collaborative Conference. I've spoken there myself. It's an amazing time and it's a great cause. And Sam, you and your team run such an incredible conference. And as I understand, it's where is it this year?
It's in the same place, so central London, Euston in London specifically. That's real central London. Can be accessed basically anywhere in the world. Fly into Gatwick, fly into Heathrow, Luton, and then then you can get to central London pretty easy.
So Sharon went ahead and put it right there on the.
Thank you, Sharon. That's perfect. Yeah. That is correct. Ideal.
Yeah. So I'm going to say it one more time. This conference is fantastic. Especially if you're anywhere in the EU, jump on a train, head on over there. It's really amazing. And I'm sad I'm not able to make it this time because of scheduling conflicts. But it's so worth your time to catch the conference. It's a really good one. So
thanks, Dave. Really appreciate that.
Okay, so there's no wrong answer to this, but I'm asking this of all my guests. Have you had a chance to watch the movie yet?
I'm so sorry, Dave. I have not. With the conference coming up, I've been desperate to, I just haven't found the time. I'm so sorry, and I know that
no. It literally
does feature it and everything. So apologies.
Yeah, no. It literally just dropped last week, and I mean, it's actually kind of fun to also talk to guests who haven't had a chance to see it yet. But you, Sam, you're some of what you say is there in the film, so you'll probably appreciate a moment where you're kind of talking about our work, which was great. However, it's okay. We have already a lot to discuss with regard to this phenomenon, right? There's a number of people who, like me, I'm not actually sure with you. Are you practicing ketogenic diet, and have you seen an increase in your cholesterol levels?
I'm kind of, keto, low carb, kind of fluctuates from time to time, probably seasonal, if anything, certainly low carb, and, occasionally, if not half the time, keto, probably more, I'd say Monday to Friday keto. That's probably the best way to say it.
and then the pub time comes around on the weekends. That is
yeah, sure, man, sure.
But yeah, so there's a number of people. Jen Unwin's a great example. She'll be on after you, for which for them it's not much of a choice. I think you and I are similar in that I bounce between low carb and keto, but I've been upfront about this on my podcast. Then I have times, for example, when I go to Europe with the missus on that's going to be, closer around June or something like that. We're going to be going to Italy. I'm just going to be upfront that I won't be totally on diet in Italy, right?
Sure, man. Sure.
But I am not.
Understandable. That's what holidays are kind of for.
I have kind of a deal with myself, and that as long as there's a lot of corresponding exercise, and as long as my numbers are looking good, then I allow for more. But and usually when I'm traveling is when I do get like a whole lot more exercise. So that works for me. It doesn't work with some other family members of mine. And
Exactly.
for people like Jen Unwin, for people like Michelle Hearn, for people like Johnny Coughlin, who we have that's who is type 1 diabetic and so forth, they have more of a reason to be more adherent to the diet, right? To that extent, when they do, often you'll see, especially if they're metabolically healthy, the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, which is a lot of what we discuss in the film. It's also central to the study that goes throughout the film that we cover. So you yourself, do you come across many lean mass hyperresponders at this point now that you've been doing this for a while?
I mean, obviously, I'm not a clinician. Just so everybody knows. So, kind of, my day to day is more just kind of, trying to reach people on a broader scale as director of PHC. I know from interacting with our volunteers and our conferences that there are a fair amount of lean mass hyper responders out there. I myself am not one, because going to my self-experiments, Dave, my overfeeding self-experiments, I know that I'm not, because I did do cholesterol tests within those, and I didn't get like the massive spike in cholesterol or anything. And gosh, I've been
let's actually drill into that for a sec.
Since 2010 at least, so 16 years. I've been low carb, stroke ketogenic.
Stroke ketogenic. Let's actually go into that real quick, because this was my first introduction to you. Is you had, I think this was literally at the beginning of my diet. So it would have had to have preceded 2015. You did do a fairly famous N of 1 experiment that you also published online. Go ahead and tell us the details on that.
Yeah, it was 2013. It did precede 2015. And basically at the time I was a personal trainer and boot camp instructor, and trying to help, members of the general public to try and understand what exactly is going on with diet and weight gain and weight loss. And as a naturally slim person, it wasn't like I could lose any more weight. Really, So my only option was to do the opposite. So to try and gain as much weight as I could. And I decided that I'd do a crossover study where I would eat 3 diets, eating twice as much as I usually would, over 3 weeks for each diet, with 3 months in between. So kind of, that biochemical reset in between the 3 diets. So on the first diet, I was eating twice as much as I usually would, so near 6,000 calories of a low carb real food diet. So, eggs and smoked salmon in the morning, then a round of kind of, almonds, like 1,000 calories of almonds mid-morning, and then 1,000 calories of mackerel and green beans at lunch, and then like 1,000 calories of walnuts in the afternoon, and then 1,000 calories of steak and green beans in the evening, and then last but not least, I think it was 1,000 calories of pecans in the evening.
This may be granted, it'd been a long time since I read that, so I didn't recall all of this. When I've done these overfeeding N of 1s, I found that I couldn't get down that many calories without having some version of a processed food, such as maybe whipping cream shake or something like that. Will you just describe to me is pretty close to whole foods. I mean, nuts, I
Mhm.
feel like is close-ish to
Mhm.
something you can get down more of, but
Yep.
that sounds so miserable from what you described. That sounds like so much
It,
food.
exactly. It's so much volume of food, and like I really had to force it down. I was satiated. Like after like 2-3 days, I was constantly satiated. It was
Yeah.
like every single mouthful was a bit of a struggle. It'd take me about an hour to eat that steak and green beans in the evening. And I'm forcing it down. It's not like
Wow.
this is easy. Now, what's interesting about that? So before I get into the next one, actually, so over those 3 weeks, right, I calculated my net calorie surplus, which is after protein thermogenic effect, loss of calories from dietary fiber, you lose about half of those in the digestive process, and then exercise as well. So I took into account exercise. So I took into as much as I could, use the Harris-Benedict formula as well. So trying to calculate kind of my metabolic rate as accurately as I could. And over those 3 weeks, I ended up in a 47,000 calorie net surplus. Right. So according to the calorie formula, should have put on 6.1 kilograms, which is approximately 14 pounds, I think. And I actually only put on 1.3 kilograms, which is just shy of 3 pounds. So, 14 pounds I should have put on, but I only put on 3 pounds.
Can I ask how old you were at the time?
So this was 13 years ago. So, gosh, what is that? About 30. Yeah, 30.
About 30. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Also, you look really good for your age. Congrats.
Thanks, man. Yeah.
I ask because I do think, and at some point I want to dig into the research on this, but I do think that there is a distinct and relative difference. It seems like, of course, when I'm in, certainly I've experienced this where like I'm in my early 20s and it seems like I can eat just about anything. And it seems like I can also eat greater portions of just about anything. And then as I'm getting into my 30s and later, past the other phase, then it changes. So the fact that you were 30 at the time, I do think is distinctive because it takes me out of that, window of time that I wonder about. So yeah, it would stand to reason if a calorie is a calorie. You should have gained a lot more weight than that.
100%. And so kind of that's an interesting observation in itself. But going on to the second one, so 3 months later, tried to kind of biochemically reset as much as possible. And I decided to do low fat, fake food over those 3 weeks. So standard American / British diet, right? So I was eating cereal and skim milk for breakfast. Mid-morning, I would have these low-fat pizzas for like these mini pizzas, Chicago town mini pizza things, for a mid-morning snack, as you do. And then lunch was skinless chicken breast sandwich with low-fat yogurt and some other stuff. And then my evening meal was a low-fat lasagna with a low-fat garlic bread.
Oh my gosh!
And then I'd finish the day off with a round of milk chocolate, basically. And so obviously I was eating twice as much as I usually would, but for a lot of people that's their daily diet. That's totally normal.
And they would have the impression that they were killing it, that they were doing great.
I'm doing all right. I'm eating a balanced diet, Right. I'm having pasta in the evening, I'm having, bread at lunch, that's fine, and cereal in the morning, absolutely fine. And so, but what I was able to do, because obviously, the calories in ultra processed foods like that, very accurately described on the back of the packets. So I was able to get my net calorie surplus within 53 calories of the first experiment. So within 53 calories. So again, a 47,000 calorie surplus. Should have put on just 6.1 kilograms, about 14 pounds. And actually, over those 3 weeks, I put on 7.1 kilograms, so about 16
Oh,
pounds. So I actually put on over the calorie formula, which is incredible. And I actually ended up putting on about 3.5 inches on my waist. And in the previous one, I forgot to mention that I lost an inch off my waist. So there you go figure.
Yeah.
Same net calorie surplus, completely different outcomes.
Super. And was there a third one, or was just those 2 phases?
There was. Yeah, so there was a third one. 3 months later, I decided to, really delve into kind of, the ultra processed food, junk food thing and real food. So I decided to do a very low fat, real food vegan diet for 3 weeks. Right. So I was having porridge oats with water and agave nectar in the morning. I think maybe I ate like a couple of bananas mid-morning. Then lunch, I think off the top of my head, was potato with like chestnuts and beans, I think. And then in the evening, it was rice with something else. Again, like going back to like that first one, the sheer volume was just insane. And I was having to really wolf it down. And just before I delve into that a bit more, on that second one, I actually never struggled to eat the food, even though it was a large amount of food. I could have kept on eating in the evening.
Yeah, well, it's a lot more processed. And this is
big time.
This is kind of a thing I've found in the circumstances where I'm not on diet, is exactly what you said. I could eat more. Like if I just wanted to just enjoy, quote unquote, enjoy food, I could have more of that food. Whereas when I'm militantly keto, I mean, my appetite's highly regulated, where it's hard to overeat. Like I even make a joke about this with family and friends. I'm trying to talk into it, where I say, I know you're worried about overeating on whatever diet you're on, but if you're keto, and I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm just saying I find it's nearly impossible to overeat steak and eggs and salmon. Like it's not there. Like and if you keep it like that, generally speaking, it tends to be better. Again, I can't say that I know this applies to everybody. I can say for those people who I know I was able to get militantly keto, it's just very difficult. But conversely, exact same calories, go with like standard American diet. Woo, wow.
Yeah.
It's almost like I could eat the same amount of calories and I could just have a whole nother meal easily.
Yeah, easy peasy, just blast through it. And so, going back to this last one where it was back to real food, but very low fat and high carb. So like 15% fat is what I was eating. And like, I think it was about 70% carbs, right? Now on this one, what was really interesting was that I was only able to get the net calorie surplus to 40,000 calories. So I was 7,000 calories short. Because the main reason for that was the amount of fiber that I was eating. So for those in the know, daily recommended intake is like 30 grams of fiber. I was eating 175 grams a day. Yeah, brutal, absolutely brutal. So
I don't think I've ever done that in any experiment. That's a lot of throughput, right?
Exactly. My wife did not like me during those periods. But that side, right? So what was really interesting for this one specifically, so calorie formula now suggested a 5.2 kilogram weight gain, so that's about 12 pounds, I think. And I actually put on 4.7 kilograms, which is more like 10 pounds, so it's 2 pounds short. So not quite the calorie formula, but certainly closer. And when you compare the first one, where I only put on 3 pounds on a 47,000 calorie surplus compared to a 40,000 calorie surplus where I put on 10 pounds. That's still quite a difference, even though the net calorie surplus is actually more on the first one. So it just goes to show, it's not all about the net calorie surplus. It's about what your body's doing with the foods that you're consuming.
Exactly. So definitely it's this spirit of what you and I have been interested in coming into this space, that a lot of
Mm,
times the N of one experiments,
mhm,
they're not necessarily definitive, of course, they often
mhm.
are hypothesis generating, but
Yeah,
they can provide a very interesting new look, and
yeah.
that's literally where all this research came from. I mean, literally cholesterolcode.com was my blog, just
Mm,
talking through all these experiments I did, and I did something like 52 self-experiments in total. A lot of it was to try to get to, this lipid energy model that's featured a lot in the movie as well.
amazing.
But let's face it, this is a common issue with people even approaching the diet. Many people who are thinking about trying low carb, particularly for like weight loss, they go,
Mhm,
I'm worried. I'm worried if I'm going to be consuming saturated fat, if I'm going to be consuming cholesterol directly, that it's going to mean more cholesterol in the blood. And one thing that we bring forward in the movie that I'm sure many will agree with, for example, Dr. David Unwin, who
mm,
doesn't see it very often in his patients, is that actually most people going on a low carb diet see their cholesterol levels either stay the same or go down. And that's
mhm.
because most people who approach the diet are doing it for weight loss, or at least very metabolically unwell, weigh a lot more. And therefore, if you weigh a lot, you're moving down, but you're not necessarily becoming very lean right away.
Mhm.
Your cholesterol levels actually often go down. We have published research on this.
Yeah, yeah, same. Like with our recent study that was published in BMJ Nutrition with the Lifestyle Club. So that's our type 2 diabetes remission coaching service here in the UK. And yeah, no, out of like 50 people, there's like no change in
Right.
cholesterol, even though they'd I think they'd like halved the amount of carbs they were eating. They're eating I think around about 100, yeah, 100 and a bit grams a day. So they're low carb, not ketogenic, but yeah, no, didn't change.
Yeah, and that's the more common scenario, particularly for people who are
It is.
adopting the low carb diet.
Mm,
For it's There's not a lot of folks that are like, say, Nick Norwitz or myself,
mhm,
or
mhm.
even Jen Unwin, depending on how
Yeah,
low carb they go, right? That
yeah,
which is the other factor, the other lever, if you
mhm,
will, is whether you go fully ketogenic, whether you go to
mhm.
like no carbs. If you've got like no carbs and you're more metabolically healthy, and particularly if you're leaner, then it's going to be more likely that you'll see it. But even then, that's why we do the research. And so
Yeah,
now with having the
exactly.
study, this is the first time we get to talk about it. I'm excited for you to see the movie because you'll
Yeah,
see
man.
the part that was added toward the end
Mm.
with regard to our results that are actually pretty exciting. So
Awesome. Yeah, no, I can't wait. I'll see if I can get it on Prime tonight and, and have a look.
yes, actually,
It'll be
thank you
awesome.
for cueing me on this one. We're gonna go ahead and throw up the graphic because the
Yeah.
UK is the one place where you can watch it for free. It's actually
Bingo.
on Prime. This was so exciting because, like, coming right out of the gate, it's TVOD, or transactional video on demand is what it's
Right.
called. But in order to get it onto Amazon streaming, it's easy enough to do as a producer of a film, provided that
Mhm.
it's sold. Now, what happens is if we get enough views, if we get enough ratings and reviews, then Amazon takes more notice and may actually make it part of their major Prime catalog everywhere. So
Amazing.
not
Yeah.
not just in the UK, but also in the US. Oh, and excitingly, by the way, when we initially launched, it was just in the US, Canada, UK, and Australia, but, Amazon expanded it to now France, Spain, and Mexico,
Brilliant.
which is
Brilliant.
pretty great.
And then is
But,
it all just is it subtitled in
I
those
believe
or
so.
dubbed? Just subtitled. Yeah.
Yes, dubbing's a bit more expensive, and I'm pretty sure the production team hasn't done it yet, but
Nah, not just yet. Yeah, yeah. See if you can get
it
11 Labs onto it.
yeah, it's another one of those things where when we initially release it, this is me, by the way, I'm 2 degrees of separation from the distributor. I'm more hearing about
I
this in
know.
the
Yeah.
meetings.
Yeah,
But
totally.
my understanding is there's kind of like a water testing kind of thing where it's put up and then we kind of see how it's doing. How it's doing has been amazing. The views have been
Awesome.
amazing. The feedback's been great. We do so far have like record-breaking ratings and reviews thus far. So that's the other piece to this, which is if you do watch the movie, please consider giving us an honest rating and review. You can just go to the Amazon.co.uk website and you can give your information there. But it doesn't just help to get the film in front of more people, potentially if it gets added to their broader catalog, but also it just helps the research. You know, I'm sure you're aware of this. I was chatting about it with Isabella before, but there's, let's just say, a bit of a headwind against low carb and keto in the research space, right?
Yeah,
So
sure.
it
I've been
doesn't,
aware.
yeah, it doesn't mean that you don't still do good research. We have to do both.
No.
We have to do good research, and then we have to work above and beyond getting it into the literature to getting the word out to other people about the research. And that's what this movie does.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just in my experience of, running PhD for the past 10 years, we've certainly seen a lot more healthcare professionals being receptive of low carb, and kind of even like the major organizations like Diabetes UK and the British Dietetics Association. I mean, we even co-authored a letter with the British Dietetics Association and with Expert Health, who's a fellow charity here in the UK, and they led on the letter, which was absolutely amazing. And this letter, was to urge NICE, which is the Medical Guidelines Organisation here in the UK, to include low carb as a viable path to remission for type 2 diabetes. And so, having that is awesome. And what's kind of going in hand with that is that low carb is actually included in the weight management guidelines for NICE. So, you can still kind of, at least in the UK, it is still recommended as a safe way to manage your weight, which is great. And we can kind of reference that kind of for type 2 diabetes remission. And I mean, just the amount of research that's out there, and for the past 10 years we've been listing all of the randomized controlled trials on our website, phcuk.org, our main website, and on there you can find the 71 randomized controlled trials between low carb and low fat, and then we've even kind of taken the 20 that are for people with type 2 diabetes, and it just low carb outperforms low fat every single time. Basically. Yeah, it's nuts.
It's great that it does seem as though it's achieving getting a lot more of that information out there. And so I appreciate the work you're doing. We also have the URL up here, the phcuk.org. Again, it's a charity, right? So it's, if people contribute, it's a charitable donation. You're not just, so especially for folks who can, it may be a tax write-off, talk to your tax preparer and so forth. But I can tell you that I've appreciated your organization so much. And again, the conference is also a great opportunity to be a part of it as well. So I really cannot thank you guys enough for being able to put that together.
My pleasure, Dave, and thank you for all the work that you do, and the Citizen Science Foundation and everything. I mean, you go above and beyond to help others. So thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have Jen hasn't come on yet, so I don't know if you have a moment longer. We did get some comments in, some comments and questions.
Go ahead.
So the first one here is from Sandy. Thank you so much. The movie is beyond excellent. I believe it keeps my cancer at bay. Thank you so much, Sandy. And I was chatting about this with Isabella earlier, and I'm sure Sam's familiar with Dr. Thomas Seyfried, who's a giant in this space, and I definitely recommend looking him up and looking at his lectures. There's also, by the way, at our conference at COSI, or the Collaborative Science Conference, a talk by Michelle Hearn, who's also is also featured in the documentary, but who has a story discussing, unfortunately, her spouse, who got diagnosed with cancer and the journey that she was on. So definitely recommend that. Next up, we've got a question here. If someone is a lean mass hyperresponder with a low CAC score, should they still care to add carbs to low cholesterol just out of precaution, or would that be necessary? I'm going to give a little bit of a less satisfying answer because I can't give medical advice. It's basically, I'm going to say, work with your doctor. Just ensure, if you can, whether or not the doctor's up on the latest science. Hopefully they are, with regard to what decisions to make. I would, by the way, I would suggest somebody who I know is staying up a lot on the literature is Dr. Tro-Kalayjian, for example. And then we have one more here, which is there a test that can show how effective a person is utilizing ketones? That's a good one. Me personally, and again, kind of harkening back to Isabella, I like respiratory quotient. Have you done that test yourself, Sam? Where you do
like a few years ago, but I forget.
Yeah. I like it a lot because to me, ketones are interesting, but they're not as interesting as actually the respiration of the cells themselves. If you can see how much they're burning fat versus burning carbs for fuel. And for that, I think the gold standard is an RQ, or sometimes called a respiratory exchange ratio, RER.
Right.
But I recommend that as well. So we do have Jen Unwin up next. And she is on standby. So I just want to give my heartfelt thanks for you taking some time with us, Sam. I really appreciate you coming on.
Absolute pleasure, Dave. Thank you for all you've done, and for your support at the PHC. I'll be sure to get on to cholesterol code, hopefully this evening, and then just send it to my family and friends and everything. So thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Next up, we've got Jen Unwin. Dr. Jen Unwin, how are you?
I'm good, thank you, Dave. Sam hasn't watched the cholesterol code. What's going on?
Yes, well, to be fair, they've all been busy. We only just dropped it last week, so yeah. I did not have that expectation for anybody. But importantly, in the UK, if we could flash up that graphic, you're on Prime, which is to say, if you are a Prime member for Amazon, you can watch the cholesterol code for free right now, which is amazing. Thank you, UK. And by the way, thank you, Jen, for sharing your story in our documentary. So for anybody who watches it, we went all the way to where you live. We got to find out about the diet you have. I don't want to give any spoilers on what diet you have, but it seems to be working pretty well for you. Is that right?
Yeah. Am I allowed to say? Yes, I'm allowed to say.
Yes, I'm of course kidding. You're definitely on a very ketogenic diet.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of, about 15 years low carb, going into keto, kind of animal based last few years. So pretty low carb keto.
Yeah, and you've spoken on it. I just had it on Sam with the public health collaboration. You've spoken on it there with this conference. But if I'm not mistaken, you also have kind of another organization that just more specifically directs interest to carb addiction itself, right? And addictive behavior around diet. Is that, could you tell us more about that?
That's right. Yeah. So Food Addiction Solutions it's a charity. It's part of a bigger charity called the Collaborative Health Community, which also has a project around children and families, encouraging them to choose real whole foods as nature intended rather than ultra processed foods, in an effort to it's like a preventative effort, really, because those of us who have a food addiction problem, like any other addiction problem, know that's a lifetime of really
having to try hard to manage those symptoms. So, you know, let's try and get our kids into adulthood without an addictive relationship to ultra processed food. So food addiction solutions, yeah, we're campaigning for the recognition of food addiction as a diagnosable disorder. We made 2 submissions to the WHO so far. Doing research, like yourself, publishing research, and education, speaking, just trying to raise awareness of this topic, which I think healthcare professionals really need, well, the public, but also healthcare professionals really need to know about, because, you know, probably if you're working with diabetes patients, you know, probably a third or more of those patients actually have an ultra processed food addiction, and so you're never going to help them with their blood sugars until that's been addressed. I think it's the next big frontier in healthcare management, well, and public health policy as well.
Yeah, so in the documentary, you find a solution, as you describe, in just getting on a low carb diet and having a whole food low carb diet. So you have, for example, lamb, you have eggs, literally around you, in the environment around you. There's a great scene that where you're taking me out there, and it's totally genuine. So one person actually asked me, "Was that scripted?" And I was like, "It's not scripted. That literally happened. Where you and I are out at the fence, and we were feeding,
shaking the bucket for the sheep."
It just feels like the most natural setting ever. It feels like it's out of a brochure or something. And I was like, and so this is like deadly, right? This is killing you. You know, and it was maybe I'm sure some people could try to find a way to be critical of it, with regard to, you know, does that therefore mean your lipid levels are not concerning or something along those lines? And that really wasn't the intent. It was more just the thought process around it. But that said, there has been of people who've watched it who've brought up what you share, and we'll go ahead and spoil this for anybody who's watching the live stream, that you do have very high levels of LDL cholesterol. It's part of why we were interviewing you, right? You're one of these lean mass hyperresponders, but then also taking the additional step of getting a CT angiogram. So I was kind of surprised that there was some controversy around that if you hadn't also gotten the imaging. So you have both the lipid levels, and you have the imaging, and you have the efficacious nature of what this diet is doing for you. Did that surprise you as well?
There's been a lot of comments on, you know, on X that you know,
Yeah.
are you crazy? And of course, I've over the years been through all the thought processes and the decision processes, and had the test done, and weighed up the pros and the cons, and listened to, you know, been to conferences with, you know, yourself and people like Ivor Cummings and other people. You know, you kind of listen to the evidence and weigh it up. And yeah, I'm happy. I'm really happy with the decisions. So David Unwin, my husband, GP, was saying, you know, maybe you should have another, you know, maybe it's time for another blood test, another scan. I don't think my total cholesterol would be quite as crazy high as it was when I took it. I was sort of super lean, very, you know, still do a lot of exercise, but I was probably doing more. And I know that, you know, from your data or this idea that, you know, is to do with the leanness, and if you're not quite as lean, then probably the cholesterol won't be quite as high. And I have had lower results in the past. You know, I think at the time I was doing quite a lot of fasting, and, you know, all of that running and things were going on. So I would actually be interested, not because I'm concerned, but I would be interesting to see on the blood test if it's quite as high as it was.
Right.
Revealing the figures, but I think so the cardiologist, Scott Murray, who also features It's not on in the documentary, but he does say, doesn't he, when we're with him, that he even asked his colleagues, and none of them had seen one ever as high. His cardiology colleagues. So it was super high at the time, and I can really see why people would think, oh, that must be familial hypercholesterolemia.
Right.
It must be, because that's the only explanation. Whereas clearly, if that was the case, I would have been ill at a younger age. Most people have got problems with that, much younger than I am, which isn't very young. Yeah, so I think that's where I'm up to with it all, really. Kind of happy to be an outlier. I think that for me, the point of being in the documentary was to help spread that message, really, that there are some black swans and you can learn things from that, rather than just kind of throw your hands up in horror. Why, the the facts are these, and I know they kind of run counter to the the usual narrative, but just like you would say, as a scientist, isn't that the more interesting kind of data? The stuff
Right.
that makes you go, hang on.
Right. Well, and to be fair, I mean, if all the data we ever had where there's extremely high levels of LDL cholesterol, that it does associate with cardiovascular disease because it was only found in those kinds of genetics, such as homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. It's a big mouthful, but we talk about it in the movie. So those same children that Brown and Goldstein were looking at 50 years ago, if that was all that was known, then I think it's understandable. But exactly what you said, if this new emergence of the phenotype that we're confronting when I'm, trying to avoid type 2 diabetes, Nick Norwitz is trying to avoid his ulcerative colitis, you're trying to avoid your food addiction, we're seeing the combination. We're seeing value in going on a very low carb diet. And we'd normally be like, great, it's good that we're also metabolically healthy. But darn, because we're metabolically healthy and on a very low carb diet and leaner, exactly what you just described earlier, that because you were leaner and more athletic, your numbers could potentially be higher.
Higher, yeah.
That you've got this irony that you then create this new phenotype for there to be something that could be looked at and studied, such as having high LDL cholesterol, high ApoB containing lipoproteins. But then there's the additional step, which really does deserve recognition, which is the imaging itself. There's so much research that has come forward, including things that predate our study, that show if you, for example, have a CAC of 0, that your LDL levels have very little association with future outcomes. That an LDL that's very high is not very different from an LDL that's very low, for example, right?
Yeah. Actually, Scott sent me yesterday. He'd put the results in the he probably sent it you as well, in one of the calculators, and he said, well, it wouldn't matter if your cholesterol was 999, your total cholesterol, because that your risk would for a heart attack in the next 10 years would still only be 2%. So
right.
Exactly as you're saying, really, that that's it's not actually pushing up the risk with the pattern that we have, and the CAC score of 0.
But that technically is not the lipid hypothesis. So the calculator, if it was going by what the present lipid hypothesis, we're talking the famous 2017 EAS consensus statement, it would say that it's quote unquote remarkably consistent for each millimole increase. There's this corresponding increase, and it's not linear, it's log linear. So in theory, right? In theory, you, myself, Nick Norwitz, and so forth, should have like symptomatic cardiovascular disease right now, right? At a population level, I should emphasize. So this is not to say, as I'm sure you would agree, that we are wanting to suggest with this movie or with anything else that LDL and ApoB should just be entirely ignored or anything along those lines. Rather, this context is an important addition
Mhm.
to the nuance and may
Yeah.
have us rethink this simplistic model of the lipid
Yeah.
hypothesis as it's a central driver. It's all that there really is, and that, or I should say that it being the central driver, any other risk factor is just amplifying it as the central driver. Because if it is the central driver, if it is, then it won't matter what the reason is for high LDL or high ApoB. There should just be corresponding risk no matter what. And that's why we do things like prospective studies like we did with
Yeah.
Keto CTA.
Yeah. Absolutely. Good.
Yeah, I also
Well,
love it.
I think you're right. I think some people have misheard the message, and they've taken the message, you never have to worry about those kinds of levels, and that we haven't taken it in context and really given it a lot of thought. We're not saying everybody with high cholesterol should just go, oh, it's everything's fine, because it's in the context of all those other things.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to just the concept of causality itself. So if something is truly independently causal, then the reason for it is not important because it's independently causal, right? So does fire burn? Yes. Okay. Is the reason for the fire important to whether it burns? No. Right. Okay. So in the case of the lipid hypothesis, the simplistic version of the lipid hypothesis is it doesn't matter why your LDL is high. It will, at a population level, result in rapid progression of plaque progression, like absolutely, right? So that's what your colleagues are reacting to. That's what I was reacting to 10 years ago, because that was the only literature we had, was those people had genetically higher LDL, and that was thought to be all encompassing with all of the other data to say, well, it doesn't matter why, it's bad, no matter what, right? So what do? You prospectively study it, because in all other circumstances for which LDL was high, it was in a cluster of other things that are independently associated with cardiovascular disease aside from the LDL and the ApoB. That's the definition of a confounder, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I mentioned that literature from before, which said, well, wait a sec. There does seem to be some heterogeneity, which in science is to just say that there's different groups, right? There does seem to be some number of folks who do have high LDL, and maybe it's for a different reason. But whatever the different reason is, if they have imaging done and the imaging does not show this corresponding development of cardiovascular disease, there's just even, and this even included with people who had monogenetic FH. This suggests that there's something else at play, right?
Yeah.
And then it doesn't become predictive. Their LDL levels do not become predictive towards their future outcomes. And that means that we can't just simply say the lipid hypothesis in its simplistic form can't apply to everybody, right? But we want to be good scientists and say, all right, now that we have prospective data that gets covered in the film, that does look very encouraging. It does suggest if the reason is for going on a ketogenic diet, this seems to support the possibility that it's not the same as what you would see in, say, those children that Brown and Goldstein were looking at.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the organization that you're working with is dealing with this food addiction. And I'm curious, how long has it been? How long have you been doing this, basically, with regard to the food addiction component in particular?
Yeah, so I've been working with Heidi Yaber, who's a nutritionist, and she's a chemical engineer by background, Dave. So she's another engineer.
Engineers for the win.
Yeah, who had her own story, and we met, maybe 10 or so years ago, I think, and started working together. And then she decided to set up this whole charity, around the topic. So obviously I was in, and we made one of the first things we did really was sort of coalesce around making this first submission to the WHO. I think that was in about 20. No, actually, to be honest, what we'd already started doing was, in the food addiction space, one thing that isn't. There's a number of academic papers on, this could be a thing, this is maybe a thing. There's loads of papers using a measure called the Yale Food Addiction Scale, developed by Ashley Gerhardt and colleagues. And once that scale exists, of course, once there's something to measure a thing, then you can measure a thing. So there were lots of papers saying, the prevalence of food addiction in the population in different clinical groups. It's obviously higher in patients with obesity, type 2 diabetes, and so on. Eating disorders, there is an overlap, although there is a difference. So, but there was really zero intervention studies. No intervention studies. And of course, if you're thinking that, this thing that looks really like addiction has all the classic symptoms of substance use disorders, according to the WHO, according to the American Psychiatric Association, then, and, you seem to be able to sort of recognize it with this YFAS tool. Well, then why aren't we taking an addiction model and applying that to the problem? Because if it's an addiction, you should treat it like an addiction. So we thought, well, let's just do it. Let's just try and find some people who say they've got food addiction symptoms. So we just did that on social media, and then designed a program based on those principles, really. And of course, the main one that we all know to do with food addiction is abstinence. Clearly, if you have an addictive relationship with alcohol, the only treatment that's effective is not ingesting alcohol. Same nicotine, same any drugs. You've got to quit it. Right. And that's, that's not easy. Otherwise, people would do it. But, we know there's effective approaches to addiction treatments for alcohol and nicotine and other drugs. So so basically it's the same with food addiction. Obviously you can't quit food, and that's part of the problem. It's what makes it quite hard, really. And also we don't give our kids alcohol and nicotine and drugs and caffeine, do we, on the whole? But we do give them sugars, ultra processed grains, and ultra processed foods, and those are the ones that really light up the reward center in exactly the same way as any other drug.
In fact, we literally use it often for that exact purpose. It's, well, you need to finish your vegetables if you want to have some cake, or I'd really like you to clean your room. If you do, you can have a cookie, right?
Exactly.
And so we ourselves are conditioned.
We know it.
Right.
It's effective as a sort of emotion management tool, as Rob Sivis would say. That's and we learn that as kids. And in fact, there's an amazing video with Eric Clapton, who was well known for having drug and alcohol problems. And the interviewer says to him, when did it start, Eric? With cocaine? And he said, oh no, with sugar as a kid. He said, that was what I had access to change my state of mind. So I just would fill my face with sugar, and it would change how I felt. And we use that in our training, and because then people say, oh yeah, no, we all know that to be true, as you say. So we thought, right, okay, so we did that, and we had groups of about 10 to 12, and the program there was actually 3. We did it also in collaboration with some guys in North America and some guys in Sweden that were running similar programs along similar ideas around abstinence from the person's drug foods. Obviously, that's reasonably individual, but it's nearly always some form of ultra processed food that's high in sugar and fat and salt. So people have to work out what are their individual sort of trigger foods, drug foods, and then abstain from those and keep to a real whole foods diet. Is usually people end up finding out that is to moving towards low carbohydrate. But we didn't really talk about keto. We didn't really talk about low carb. A lot of people kind of drift that way or would find out about it. So we did that study, and we've recently published the 12-month follow-up results, and we were able to find 62% of the completers in remission from food addiction, so no longer meeting the criteria. yeah, it was. We were amazed that it was so good. And lots of people, when you looked at the YFAS scores, yeah, lots of people moving out of that category, moving into the sort of no food addiction category. Also, there we measured well-being, mental well-being, and that shows the opposite. That massively increases with the treatment and was sustained at 12 months. So you do need to keep supporting people, just like any other addiction problem. You know, we all understand that about alcohol, you know, that's something that somebody's going to have to kind of be thinking about and working on for the rest of their lives.
Yeah,
in
it's
whatever way they do that. It's the same. Once you've got addicted, it's the same issue.
it's structural. Like it's something that is just kind of a part of how you've I mean, a lot of the nature of addiction is an effort to cope. It's a self-soothing.
Hmm.
And the exactly what you described, I think, is terrible. I think for many who are watching, they're familiar with what's known as the DSM, that you can make a diagnosis on various forms of like addiction. But food addiction, as I understand it, is still not in the DSM, right?
Not there. Not
Which
there.
is crazy.
Ashley Gerhardt and colleagues in the States have made an application to the DSM. So there's one into the WHO and one into the DSM. So, and we're waiting to hear from both. So, you know, who knows? Fingers crossed.
Yeah,
I mean,
because
we'll get there in the end.
basically, in order for you to claim it's a medical disorder, right? The DSM not listing it means that it's only colloquially, considered one. You can say you've got a food addiction, and somebody could rightly say, "Well, my doctor says that doesn't even exist." Right?
Yeah.
And it absolutely exists and has all the characteristics that we're talking about, except it could be arguably worse than, say, smoking and drinking, because you don't actually need to smoke or drink. You do need to eat. And so if you're further comforted by believing that there's just no such thing as a food addiction, but then also simultaneously, while you're comforted that there's no such thing as a food addiction, simultaneously feeling like you just lack the willpower to do it, in spite of everybody around you saying, just try harder not to eat that cake, try harder not to have that shake. It makes it more difficult for you to then acquire the skill set to understand what you need to do behaviorally, and to build on to make the change. And I think that that's just super important.
Yeah, we saw that a lot in people coming forward, that that they really felt it was their fault. They were very ashamed that they'd never been able to manage the behavior. No one had ever said to them, it's not your fault. It's to do with the food, your brain's reaction to the foods. And also, they would say that as well. We're cued hundreds of times a day to eat by advertisements, by going in the gas station and seeing chocolate bars, and just all the time there's these cues to eat that we don't get so many of with alcohol and smoking and other things, because it's regulated. And because people don't believe in it, then you go to a social occasion and people will sort of try and push it on you, or say it's your birthday just one, and that's where public education comes in, because you'd never say that to a friend who's
an alcoholic.
Quit alcohol. You'd be buying them, getting them special non-alcoholic stuff, or really encouraging them.
But arguably that took like 100 years of people finally getting, like, it took so long for people to finally really internalize, if they themselves are not an alcoholic, how serious alcoholism is a disease. And it came from just a regular and constant sense from alcoholics themselves, educating the general public, such as the very thing you described, still calling themselves alcoholics long after they're into sobriety and so forth. That's part of the program. Part of the program is to just recognize it's always there.
Just own it. And, that's what we try and do, with people that we work with, or whenever I talk on, in the media, or, in the newspapers or whatever, I say, I'm a food addict, in recovery at the moment, but, who knows, stuff can happen.
It's always there.
It's always there, and it's, you know, it's always, it's a bit like, we sort of say it's a bit like a leaky boat. So, you know, you kind of, you know, you can be doing really well, but what you need to know is that boat is actually leaky. So you need to do some work at some point, because it's always going to find a way in. It's always looking for a way to sort of, like, oh, it's your birthday, or you're on holiday, or you're not feeling so good, or, you know, you don't feel well, or you've had a row with somebody, and there's always a reason,
a catalyst, right?
slip.
And
Yeah.
and it's the and it's the recognition, and especially community. I really do feel like food
Mm,
addiction in general, it do not underestimate how much the social can impact you, and I think we just underestimate that all the time.
massively.
We fancy ourselves as having more willpower than we
We
often
do.
do in a situation with a lot of peer pressure.
Yeah.
We, grandma made her favorite pie. Why
Same.
everyone's having a slice, Dave? Why aren't you having a slice with us? And,
And
yeah, you
probably,
know what?
it's your childhood favorite pie. You know, it's probably that pie
Exactly.
that
Right.
you look forward to. And oh, absolutely. And of course, that's why Alcoholics Anonymous has survived, because people needed they needed that sense of community, that sense of people going through the same thing that they were going through. And you know, there are programs developing now for food. Well, there is Overeaters Anonymous, but there's lots of programs. There's quite a few in the States now, people working on this. Unfortunately, it's not, you know, because it's not a recognized condition, it's not available, you know, like here on the NHS, or over there you can't get reimbursed. And that's what recognition would bring. It would also bring more money for research, looking at, you know, comparing treatments, or looking at, you know, some medication. You know, we won't get into the whole GLP-1 issue, but, you know, I think it would just change everything. I think that's why it's going to be a difficult fight, because if, you know, we don't serve alcohol and cigarettes in hospitals because we recognize they're addictive.
Right.
I mean, there was a time in the UK when you could smoke and have a little tot of something in the evening. I remember my granddad was given stout, like, it's a kind of dark beer. It's got lots of iron in it. I remember him being given stout in hospital. Right, you'd never get that now. And I think there's broader implications of food addiction being recognized, because it recognizes that some foods can be addictive, and then that means some food shouldn't be served in schools and hospitals. So
I hope that changes,
massive,
because what I
massive.
see served in hospitals right now, and I literally visited one, for the family member who was being hospitalized for something serious and has severe diabetes, and
Mm.
uh, there's
Oh,
pancakes and syrup and pizza, and I'm like, "How is this even getting cooked in a hospital? Like, why aren't they?"
why? And we have the same here, because obviously we run, in David's practice, we run groups for patients with type 2 diabetes, and they often say, you know, I'm really worried about going into hospital because my control's really good, and I just know that, you know, either I eat nothing or my relatives have to bring in all the food. You know, it's going to be really hard. So we've actually had them writing letters to the hospital to say, you know, I'm just checking, you know, if I come in, I'll be able to maintain my low carbohydrate diet.
Yeah, that's part of the challenge. You've been so generous with your time, Dr. Jen Unwin. If you don't mind, I'm gonna throw in one more pitch on again, you're featured in our movie, The Cholesterol Code,
Mhm.
and we'll just throw this up real quick. For those of you in the UK, our Brits across the pond, you can watch this right now for free if you are a Prime member in Amazon. It's so amazing that the movie's been doing as well as it has. But I love your story in particular. I love that we got as much great footage and that gorgeous landscape around. And I'm sure your story will continue to drive a lot of chatter online. I'm hopefully it's more
Yeah.
positive, but it is funny, as is often the case with science, right? Disruption comes with the awakening and the paradigm shift. And that may be what we're looking at here. We'll see, right? As the research continues.
Yeah,
So
definitely. I loved all the stories. I thought, you know, Robin and Nick, you know, it's just yeah, it's the human stories, isn't it, that make the science come alive and are so important.
No, that's such a great way of saying it. You know, we need to have both. We need to have both the science, but we also need to have the stories. And so, yes, if my last call to action is, if you can check it out, you can watch it for free. And if you want to, you know, after you've watched it, consider also coming back to Amazon, like on your computer, and consider giving us an honest rating and review. We love those ratings and reviews as well. And it's actually the single most impactful thing to help drive success of the movie, which in turn helps to drive success of the research. So, Dr. Jen, thank you so much for jumping on and closing out this little super stream with your
mini stream.
Yes, mini stream. But I do look forward to our longer Feldman Protocol podcast, which I'll be recording with you in June.
Great. Yeah. See you soon in the UK.
All right. Cheers. Thank you so much.
Bye.
And thank you to all of you who've managed to tune in. I realize some are tuning in real time, but if you haven't had a chance to hear about it, cholesterolcodemovie.com, you see down there in the ticker. It is our film. It dropped last week. It's doing awesome. And I'll actually have some more news, including a new trailer that I believe is going to get released today. It's been such a great ride. So once again, thank you so much to the UK folks who got to join, Dr. Isabella Cooper, Sam Feltham, and also, of course, Dr. Jen Unwin. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening if you're in the UK, and I hope you have a wonderful day if you're here in the US. Cheers.